The Mau Uprising was a fierce and desperate war for land and freedom that erupted in British colonial Kenya. Beginning officially in 1952 and lasting until 1960, this conflict represented the boiling point of decades of accumulated grievances. It was not merely a series of isolated skirmishes but a profound and violent rejection of foreign domination by a people pushed to the very edge of their endurance. At its core, the uprising was a struggle waged primarily by the Kikuyu people, Kenya's largest ethnic group, who had been systematically dispossessed of their ancestral lands and stripped of their political voice. The rebellion became a brutal defining chapter in the history of British decolonization in Africa, a story of clandestine oaths, guerrilla warfare in dense forests, and a colonial response of overwhelming and often indiscriminate force. The name Mau itself is shrouded in mystery. Its exact origins are uncertain. For the British colonial administration, the term was a convenient label. They painted the movement as a savage, atavistic cult. However, for the majority of Kenyans who took up arms or supported the cause, Mau signified a fight for Ithaka na Wiyati, land and freedom, a righteous struggle to reclaim what had been unjustly taken from them and to restore their dignity as a people. This conflict was a deeply asymmetrical one, pitting poorly armed guerrilla fighters against the full might of the British Empire. The seeds of the Mau rebellion were sown long before the first shots were fired in 1952. They were planted at the turn of the 20th century when the British Empire formally established the East Africa Protectorate. The British government encouraged thousands of white settlers to immigrate, promising them vast tracts of fertile land. This land, however, was not empty. It was the ancestral home of numerous Kenyan communities, most notably the Kikuyu, whose entire social, economic, and spiritual identity was tied to the soil. The creation of the White Highlands, an area of over 12,000 square miles, reserved exclusively for European farming, was achieved through the forced and often violent eviction of Africans from their homes. This large-scale land alienation created a massive class of landless Kenyans who were then forced into a new colonial economy designed to serve European interests. Many became squatters on the very farms that had once been their ancestral lands, working for white settlers in exchange for a small plot to cultivate and meager wages. This system was rife with exploitation, as settlers could evict squatters at will, leaving families destitute and homeless. Furthermore, the colonial government imposed various taxes such as the hut tax and poll tax, which had to be paid in cash. This forced African men to leave their villages and seek wage labor on European farms or in burgeoning cities like Nairobi, disrupting traditional family structures and social cohesion under harsh and often discriminatory working conditions. Beyond the economic exploitation, British rule imposed a system of racial segregation and political disenfranchisement that stripped Kenyans of their autonomy and dignity. The Mau movement did not emerge from a vacuum, but evolved from earlier forms of political protest that had proven insufficient. For years, organizations like the Kikuyu Central Association had attempted to petition the colonial government. They wrote letters, sent delegations to London, used every peaceful means at their disposal, but their pleas fell on deaf ears. Frustrated by the failure of moderate politics, a more militant faction began to grow within the Kikuyu community. This radical wing believed the British would never relinquish power or return the land willingly. They concluded freedom would have to be seized through a more direct and forceful struggle, leading to a secret, oath-based movement. The oath was the movement's organizing tool and spiritual heart. A sacred, binding promise transformed politics into a personal spiritual commitment. Different levels existed, but the oath of unity bound initiates to fight for land and freedom, keep secrecy, and never cooperate with the colonial enemy. Ceremonies were steeped in Kikuyu symbolism, held at night in secret places. Soil goat's blood, other symbolic items like amulets and herbs. The ritual forged unbreakable solidarity, discipline, and resilience against colonial repression. While predominantly Kikuyu, it was not exclusive. Members of Embu joined, members of Meru joined. The movement drew support from landless squatters, the urban poor in Nairobi, and disenfranchised youth. These were people with the least to lose and most to gain. The uprising became both a civil war and a war of liberation, pitting radicals against loyalists, often wealthier land-owning Africans, chiefs, policemen, members of the Home Guard. The initial rebellion, from the late 1940s into 1952, featured civil disobedience. Governor Sir Evelyn Baring used it as a pretext to declare a state of emergency, plunging Kenya into full-scale war. When discussing the leadership of the anti-colonial movement in Kenya, the name Jomo Kenyatta inevitably comes to the forefront. Jomo Kenyatta, an articulate and charismatic figure. Kenyatta had been a leading voice for African rights since the 1920s. He served as General Secretary of the Kikuyu Central Association. He spent 15 years in Europe, from 1931 to 1946. He studied anthropology. He wrote his seminal work Facing Mount Kenya. He lobbied tirelessly for his people's cause on an international stage. Upon his return to Kenya, he was elected president of the Kenya African Union. The Kenya African Union was the leading nationalist political party. He was widely seen by Kenyans as the father of the nationalist movement, the one leader with the stature to unite the country and negotiate with the British. However, Kenyatta's relationship with the Mau Mau movement itself was complex and remains debated. Publicly, he was a moderate nationalist who advocated change through peaceful negotiation and constitutional means. He explicitly denounced the violence and secret methods of the Mau Mau. Despite his public disavowals, the colonial government, and particularly Governor Baring, was convinced he was the secret mastermind. They viewed his leadership of KAU as a respectable front for violent rebellion. In the immediate aftermath of the declaration of the state of emergency, he and 5 other prominent KAU leaders were arrested. They became known as the Kapenguria Six: Bildad Kajia, Kungu Karumba, Fred Kubai, Paul Nge, Achieng Oneko. They were subjected to a highly publicized and deeply flawed show trial. The trial was held in a remote northern town to limit public access. Despite a complete lack of credible evidence linking him directly to managing Mau Mau, Kenyatta was found guilty of managing the proscribed society. The conviction and imprisonment had the opposite effect of what the British intended. Instead of decapitating the movement, it transformed him into a political martyr. The declaration of the state of emergency in October 1952 unleashed a wave of systematic and brutal repression codenamed Operation Jock Scott. The immediate goal was to sever the head of the nationalist movement, arresting Jomo Kenyatta, other key political figures. Massive sweeps followed through Nairobi. The Kikuyu reserves, tens of thousands rounded up and screened for Mau Mau sympathies. These screenings were often brutal affairs relying on torture and coercion by hooded informants to extract confessions and identify suspects. The British aimed to isolate the guerrilla fighters in the forests, cutting off their supply lines of food, weapons, and new recruits from the civilian population. A critical turning point was the Lari massacre in March 1953. Mau Mau fighters attacked the village of Lari, targeting the families of Home Guard members and other loyalists. Over 70 people, mostly women and children, were brutally killed. The colonial government seized upon this horrific event, publicizing it widely as proof of Mau Mau's inherent savagery. This propaganda turned international opinion against the rebels and justified the government's own escalating violence. The British military response, led by General Sir George Erskine, was multifaceted and ruthless. Deployment of British troops, Royal Air Force aerial bombing of the forests, massive expansion of the Kikuyu Home Guard. A key strategy was villagization, forced relocation of over 1 million Kikuyu into 800 heavily guarded villages enclosed by barbed wire and trenches. The most notorious element was the creation of a vast system of detention camps, what colonial officials called the pipeline. The climax of this brutality came with the Hola massacre in March 1959, where 11 detainees were clubbed to death by their guards. For the thousands of men and women who took to the forests of Mount Kenya and the Aberdaries, life was a relentless struggle for survival. These were not trained soldiers but ordinary people, farmers, laborers, clerks, driven by a profound hope for freedom. They faced a formidable enemy in the British military, which possessed superior firepower, aerial surveillance supplies. The forest fighters, in contrast, were often armed with homemade guns, pangas, stolen rifles, and their intimate knowledge of the difficult terrain. Daily life was a constant battle against hunger disease, the cold, wet conditions of the high-altitude forests. They relied on raids and a network of sympathizers in the reserves for food medicine information, a lifeline that became increasingly tenuous as the British tightened their control. Despite the immense hardships, the forest fighters maintained a remarkable degree of organization and morale, fueled by their deep conviction in the righteousness of their cause. They established command structures with leaders like Field Marshal Dedan Kimathi, creating a semblance of a guerrilla government in the forest, complete with its own courts parliaments. Hope was sustained through songs of freedom prayer, the continued administration of oaths that reaffirmed their commitment to the struggle for Ithaca na Wiati. Meanwhile, for the hundreds of thousands of Kenyans caught in the colonial dragnet, a different kind of hell unfolded within the detention camps of the pipeline. Here, the struggle was not against bullets and bombs, but against systematic torture and psychological degradation. The British authorities were determined to force every detainee to confess their oath and renounce Mau Mau. Detainees were subjected to beating, starvation, extreme forms of physical and mental abuse. Yet even in these horrific conditions, a powerful spirit of resistance persisted. Many detainees known as hardcore refused to cooperate. The hope that sustained both the fighters in the forest and the prisoners in the camps was the dream of an independent Kenya. The Mau Mau Uprising was militarily defeated by 1960, with the forest fighters largely crushed and the state of emergency officially lifted. However, the rebellion was a profound political victory that fundamentally altered the course of Kenyan history. The sheer cost and brutality of the war made it impossible for Britain to continue ruling Kenya as it had before. The conflict, particularly the scandal surrounding the Hola Camp massacre, exposed the savage underbelly of British imperialism to the world and to a British public that was growing weary of colonial entanglements. In the immediate aftermath of the emergency, the British began to hastily prepare Kenya for independence. A series of constitutional conferences were held in London, known as the Lancaster House Conferences. A key sticking point was the fate of Jomo Kenyatta. While the British government under Governor Patrick Renaissance still publicly denounced him as a leader to darkness and death, it became clear that no stable independent government could be formed without him. African nationalist leaders refused to participate fully until Kenyatta was released. Bowing to immense internal and international pressure, the British finally released him from restriction in August 1961. He quickly assumed leadership of the Kenya African National Union and led the country to independence on December 12, 1963, becoming its first prime minister and later its first president. Upon taking power, Kenyatta's government adopted a surprising policy of forgive and forget. In an effort to build a unified nation and reassure the white settler minority and foreign investors, he urged Kenyans to move past the bitterness of the colonial era. This policy had complex and lasting consequences. While it helped to prevent a mass exodus of white capital and expertise, it also meant that the core grievances of the Mau Mau fighters, particularly the issue of land, were never fully addressed. Many of the loyalists who had collaborated with the British retained their positions of power and wealth in the new government, while many of the former freedom fighters and their families remained landless and impoverished, feeling betrayed by the very independence they had fought so hard to achieve. Today, the legacy of the Mau Mau Uprising continues to shape Kenya's social and political landscape. For decades, the story of the rebellion was suppressed, with the Mau Mau officially designated as terrorists, and their contribution to independence largely written out of the official national narrative. However, in recent years, there has been a powerful movement to reclaim this history. In 2003, the Kenyan government lifted the ban on Mau Mau, officially recognizing the veterans as national heroes. A landmark court case in the United Kingdom resulted in a formal apology and compensation from the British government in 2013 for the torture of detainees. The Mau Mau story is now a vital, albeit painful, part of Kenya's national identity, a testament to the extreme cost of freedom, and a continuing reminder of the unresolved struggles for